Hey everyone, Newman here with 910, and today we have a Crown Mark 1. As we can see right here, there's no Mark 2, but it does have the Picatinny rail, so it's kind of the in-between, like the Crown Mark 1.5 kind of. We are going to be doing a complete reseal on this. As you can see, I've already removed the barrel and the bottle. We're not going to be covering that today. It's just going to be resealing the actual action itself, so the main portion of the rifle. Okay, so to start, obviously we need to take it out of the stock. To take the stock off, we have a couple different places. I have a video going over this. We have the safety switch, we have the power wheel, and then we have the two stock screws. So I'm going to quickly go ahead and take all those off, and we'll go back to the reseal. Now we have the action out of the stock. So to go over the points of reseal for an FX Crown, you have the valve assembly, which is your valve housing, valve pin, and valve seat, your bottle adapter, your two gauges, your fill port, your regulator, your plenum plug, and your transfer port adjuster, or your power wheels, some people may call it. Those are the places of reseal on a Crown. As you may have just noticed, be careful with these gauges, whether it's the FX gauges or aftermarket ones such as these Huma ones. These covers do easily come off, so you just have to be careful with them. In any case, we're going to go step by step going through each part. We're going to chapter it out so that if you have to do a specific reseal, you can see in the video how to get to that specific place. Or if you're just doing overall reseal, you can still watch the entire video and watch the entire process. Alright, so we're going to start with the two gauges. Taking those off, you'll need an 11mm wrench. It's good to use a thin 11mm wrench like this. And see how thin that is to reach up underneath there. A thicker 11mm such as this, most of the time does not fit up underneath to grab the gauge. You typically cannot get that up underneath correctly. Whereas a thin 11mm, you're able to get in there and grab it. They shouldn't be on there very tight. They're typically just barely on there tight. So it just takes a couple turns of the wrench. Make sure, again, it's completely depressurized. As you can see, there's no pressure. There's obviously no bottle. I'm just going to speed up taking these off. So once you have the two gauges off, the next thing we can take off is the fill port or the quick connect. You will need a 14mm wrench. It can be a deep well socket, a full size wrench, or it can be a thin wrench such as this, as long as it's 14mm. It's going to be a little on there, a little snug, but it'll snap off just like that. And once it's loose, you'll be able to put that wrench down most likely and take it off with your fingers. Once you have the fill port off, there's two O-rings. There's an O-ring right here. And then you may have to use a tool to punch it out. But then you have your actual fill port or your check valve right here. On this gold rod, it is a 2.5 by 1.5 MBR90, and on the quick connect, the backside here is a 10 by 1 MBR90. After those are off, the next thing we can take off is the bottle adapter. This is going to be on there very tight and most likely Loctited, so you will have to put the action in a vise in order to get it off, and it uses a 24mm wrench. So again, you can use a full size or a thin one such as this, or you can use a deep well socket to take it off. In any case, it is going to be on there very tight. Like I said, sometimes you have to heat up because there is Loctite, but you will certainly need the vise because it's on there very tight again. So I'm going to go do that real fast and be right back to you. Okay, so as you can see there's a little bit of Loctite. You might be able to see that residue there. But in any case, and you might be able to see that residue that was around there. But there's just two rubber steel washers, FX part number 11507. That's what seals each side of your bottle connection. Okay, so we're going to set this to the side and move on. Alright, so after we got that off, the next thing we can do is the regulator. So to start the regulator, you'll need a 2.5 to pull out the adjustment screw. On the adjustment screw, you have a 2x190, or you've got two 2x190s. Next is the regulator housing. You'll need a 5mm for that. Be careful, because sometimes one of your washers, or even multiple of your washers, typically it's only one, can come out with the regulator. So just at this point, just take that, set it back into the action. But here's your regulator housing. If you have an amp regulator, it is a 7.5x2 and a 4x1.5, both of them MBR 70. Now we need to pull the regulator piston out of the inside. If you do not have a regulator piston tool, you'll need to pick up a pair of hemostats, such as this. You need to reach down in there, grab the tip of the piston very lightly, and pull it out. If it's in there snug and you have to grip tightly, sometimes you may actually damage the tip of the piston and you'll have to replace that. If you don't damage the piston though, you don't have to replace it. So you've got your washer stack on here, you want to try to keep that the same as it is. And then you have a 4x1.5 MBR 70 on the regulator piston. I can't show it, but on the inside of the action here, there is a, for an amp regulator, there's a 10x1.5 MBR 90, or there for a preamp regulator, it's a 9x1.5 MBR 90. Where it's going to sit is if you have the regulator piston and washers down in there, the regulator or the O-ring for that regulator housing, it seals on the outside of the housing here, but it will sit, the O-ring groove for it is just above this last washer. In any case, so you'll have that washer down there. As you can still see, I still have my 2 gauge seals right there. You may have Delrin, you may have an O-ring, depends on if you have an aftermarket gauge installed, if you have an X-ring, or if you have the original Delrin. In any case, it has to be replaced. I would recommend using an X-ring. The X-ring size is 3.63 by 2.62. Okay, the second, or one of the last things here is the valve housing. After the valve housing, like I said, we have the transfer port and the plenum plug. But for the valve housing, you'll need a 4mm, and it's just, that's a hex hole right there. Doesn't take much force, and it unscrews right out. On the outer part of this housing, you have your large O-ring, so it's 11.6 by 2.4 MBR 90. And then you have your spring seat. Underneath your spring seat, you have another 2.5 by 1.5 MBR 90. It's the same as your check valve and your Foster or your quick fill. So we're going to set that to the side. To remove the valve assembly, you will need another pair of hemostats or needle nose pliers. So there's your valve spring and your valve pin. And then down in there you have your valve seat. If you take a pair of hemostats, stick it through, open them up to create pressure or tension, and pull up, it should pull out. And you've got the one O-ring on there, and you got one O-ring on the tip of the valve pin. But honestly, you should just replace your valve seat and your valve pin whenever you're doing a reseal. Okay, great. So once you have the valve removed, we can move on to the transport adjustment wheel. This part is not going to leak per se on the rifle. What it's only going to see is once you take a shot out of the rifle, it may leak at that point, as in the air pressure will come out the sides of the wheel, and that's when you need to replace the O-rings on this. In any case, it is still part of a full reseal, so we're going to go over it. There's a 2.5mm on each side. You're going to want to remove the one out of the center of the wheel first, because it's going to be hard to grab the internals once the other side is actually taken out of the rifle. So we're going to take this one out first. It typically requires a high torque hex key and possibly even some heat, because most of the time it is Loctited in. So we're going to go ahead and do that off screen and be right back. Okay, so once that screw is removed, we can set that to the side, and we can flip it over to this other side. Just a quick note, there is some exception here. Sometimes the model was made with a Torx head instead, which I believe was like a T20 or T25. So you may see that instead of a 2.5, but for this it was a 2.5. So there you go, there's the screw. We're going to set that to the side. Go ahead and set the Allen key to the side. And we're just going to be able to pull this straight out. Make sure you lay the action on its side though, because there is a spring and a ball bearing. The ball bearing may come off with it. So we're just going to take that ball bearing, we'll set it back with the action, and we're going to set the action to the side. So now you have your transport adjustment wheel. As you may see, there's this fine crease right here, because that's actually the separation between two pieces. And there you go, there's your two pieces. Your two O-rings on the big piece are 11.1 by 1.6 NBR90, and the two O-rings on the small piece are 5.5 by 2 NBR70. Okay, so the last thing to pull off of this action is the plenum plug. It is part of a full reseal, yet it's probably the least likely to leak area. So we are going to go and pull that off. What that does require is the removal of the trigger. So you will have to pull out this trigger pin right here. I typically recommend a 5/64 pin punch. You can use a 1.5 or 2 millimeter if you have a metric. And that way, because it is a 2 millimeter metric pin. In any case, it's best to hold the action like this. Hold the trigger down. Punch out the pin. Continue to hold the trigger down, pull the pin out, set it down, and then grab the trigger. There is a spring underneath, and that's why you have to hold it down. So to remove the plenum plug, you will need some sort of spanner, or else you can use my plenum plug tool. I made this special tool right here with a hex head in the back to easily remove this without the need of a spanner. Since typically a spanner this size is not in your typical household goods, a 4mm Allen key is, because you already need it for the rest of your disassembly here. So basically this lines up just like that. Take your 4mm, you stick it in just like that, and sometimes you can be strong enough to remove it. So this one's coming out easier than normal. Sometimes you have to put in a vise. So I'm going to fast forward doing this because it's a very careful procedure not to scratch it. Okay, so there we have it. We have it pulled out to where we can just grab it with our fingers. This O-ring is a 14 by 2 NBR70. Okay, so now we've officially taken all the O-rings out of the action. I'm going to set this to the side and actually show the installation of the O-rings and stuff on the pieces themselves. So as mentioned before, we're just going to replace the valve seat and the valve pin, so we're just going to throw those away. So the first piece that we're actually replacing seals on will be the bottle adapter. As you can see, I've cleaned it up a little bit, cleaned up the threads, but there's two seals on here, two rubber steel washers. We have to remove those. The best way to remove those is with a dental pick. Pretty much with any O-ring you're going to be removing with a dental pick. I like this particular dental pick. I don't think there's an exact name for it. But basically it's a hook on one end and this the straight angle hook on the other one. They both serve purposes. This one gets into narrow places, whereas this one's able to get into deep places. So for instance, for this instance, I'm going to use the more of a straight hook one. I'm going to hook up underneath that seal, because there's the rubber on the inside and there's the steel on the outside. So you can either stab through the rubber if you're not going to reuse it, or you can come from the outside like that. But they're typically pretty easy to come off just like that. So again, you can stab in the rubber, pull it up, come over to the outside. Well, there you go. Pull on the rubber, come to the outside, and then you're good to go. Another thing, once you have the seals off, it's always best to go ahead and clean out all the old lube that was underneath the old seals. So you can just take a shop towel or microfiber towel, anything like that, that's not going to contaminate the area, and just give it a good old wipe out. So after I got it all cleaned up, I'm going to put on my 2 new seals. Just pop them on like so. There you go. Now it's new sealed. Now before we put on the rifle, we are going to put some silicone lube on these rings. So after you got the rubber steel washers on there, the next step is going to be to lube them up, and that's going to be the following step for all these O-rings. One of the most common lubes that I recommend is obviously Super Lube. The part number is 92003. There's also a Super Lube that is specifically made for O-rings, and that is part number 93003. So 92003 or 93003, those will work. Both work perfectly for the application of the O-rings in your air gun. All right, so basically this, and take the cap off. I got a handy dandy little like a pipe brush, a little makeup brush, something like that. Basically just get some here on the tip, just like that. And you're spreading it on the sealing surface, so the rubber itself. That's the only place it needs to be, is on the rubber itself. All right, so now that we have this all lubed up, we can take our action and put it back on. And as before, you need a 24mm tank. Take it, tighten it down the rest of the way. Typically you'll see the flat comes up here. Sometimes it is the point, but it's a lot better if it's the flat up top. It makes installation of the valve housing a lot easier. So there you have it. That's all you need to do for the bottle adapter. You don't have to torque it on super tight or anything like that. Just hand tight and you're good to go. So we're going to move on to other pieces of the rifle now. So for the remaining piece of the rifle, I've got them all right here. I'm just going to quickly go through them, show the replacing of the O-ring, and once the O-ring's replaced, I'm going to set them over here. And by the time we have our full stack over here, then I'll show the installation to the rifle. Okay, so the next one I'm just going to pick up the easiest is your Plenum Plug right here. And once again, you're going to grab your pick. Just going to stab into the old O-ring, bend it over, just like that, and there you go. Set this to the side and grab your new O-ring. This is a 14x2 MBR70. So once again, we're going to lube. I'm going to go ahead and pre-lube all the O-rings now for the remaining O-rings, so you can just know that whenever I'm installing an O-ring, it does have lubrication on it. So remember to do that step. Always remember to lubricate your O-rings. Okay, so now that my O-ring's lubricated, just going to take it, find the O-ring groove right here, take it, and just fold it right over. And there you go. It goes right on perfectly. Okay, so that's the first one to the side. Next we're going to grab here is the Foster. You got the one O-ring right here on this Foster connection. So you're going to grab your pick, doesn't matter which end. It's pretty simple. You're just going to take that, and you're gently stab into this little tiny O-ring here and pry it out of the groove, and there you go, it pops out, and once it's out, it's pretty easy. There you go. Okay, so got the new O-ring. It's a 10x1 NBR90. So just going to take it, work it over the threads. It's going to fall a little bit loose, and you just got to press it in to the groove. There you see, it went right into the groove there. So now it's all good, it's ready to go. So we just need to set this to the side now. Next one is your check valve or your Foster. The piston for your Foster is also your check valve. It's a 2.5 by 1.5 NBR90. It's really simple. You just take it, grab it, and slide it off. So we're going to set this to the side and grab the new one. Alright, so once you have the new O-ring, if you got your piston, You just take it, pop it over the end there, and just slide it down. And it's good to go. Okay, so the next piece we're going to get to is your power wheel, the outer and the inner. Set this down real fast. We're going to start with your outer. These are 11.1 by 1.6 MBR90. And to get them off, you're going to take your pick. You're going to do the middle one first. So they are 90, so they're a little bit tough. Yeah, take that. So basically you grab it up, you grab the O-ring with something else, and then you spin the tool around. And basically you just have to make sure that the O-ring does not go back into the groove. So once the O-ring is completely out, you can pull your tool off and just slide that O-ring on off. There you go, there's the first one. Set that to the side. Now that the first one's off, the second one's a lot easier. Stab the O-ring. And pull it off. You don't have to pull it over the entire section, so it's really easy to pull off. So, once you have your two new rings lubed up, take the first one, pop into the first groove. Take the second one, slide it back over the same way. They are MBR 90, so they are tough. Be careful sliding over these holes, make sure it's not getting cut. Try to lift up and pull as you're pulling. Don't try to just drag it, try to like lift up the edge that you're pulling on and pull it. So there you go though, it pops into both grooves. Now this piece is done and we can set it to the side. Alright, so now we have the inner piece here. These are 5.5 by 2 MBR 70. Since they are so thick, they are hard to get off. But once again, we're going to start with the inner one and pull it off, and then we're going to go to the outer one. So, we're going to get into the O-ring here. It's pretty difficult to stab because it's just this location. And we're going to try to pull it into the port here. And once we're in the port, you can stick your tool through like that. See how it's through the O-ring and out the other side. I can go around here with my fingernail. Be careful not to stab myself on that tool. And you see the O-ring started breaking right there. And pull it out the rest of the way. Once you got that, slide on off. And then this one, doesn't matter which side you use. It's pretty simple. Make sure not to scar your O-ring sealing surface. Make sure you're stabbing into the O-ring. You'll see that's why my tool pops off sometimes, because it's in the O-ring rather than the groove. And there you go. Now both O-rings are off. Alright, so once you got your two new O-rings all lubed up, it's best to set this on a flat surface, such as this. Take your fingers and stretch and roll over just like that. As you can see, it popped right into that groove. And this next one, you do the same thing, stretch, roll over. Once it's there, you'll be able to slide it and then pop right into place. Now these two pieces are nice and full resealed, ready to go back into the rifle. Okay, so the next piece here is your valve housing. You've got two O-rings on it. The first one's going to be underneath the spring seat. So this is also called the top hat, because you can see it looks like a little top hat. I'm just going to set that to the side for right now. Underneath that, you'll see there was an O-ring. You just take, so it's just loosely fit in there. It's a 2.5 by 1.5 MBR 90. As you might remember, it's the same O-ring that's on your check valve. Okay, so we got the new O-ring, got it lubed up. just sits right in there. Then you take your top hat, and it's got a little ridge here on the bottom. You just take it. You just set it right back on top. That's it. It doesn't snap, it doesn't lock into place or anything. It just sits right on top. Typically the little groove helps hold it into place. Sometimes it's not perfect though, so it just sits there right on top. The next O-ring is the big one right here that seals the actual valve housing against the action. It is an 11.6 by 2.4 MBR 70. With this O-ring, you're going to take the square end, because you are so close to that groove, you don't want to scratch it. And you just pop it off just like that. It just folds right off. Alright, so once you got your new O-ring and it's all lubed up, you just, and as you can see, there's nothing holding on the top hat, so sometimes it can fall off. Make sure you don't lose it. Just take your O-ring on the back side here. You just start it in the groove. Take it and you just fold it right over, just like that. It's good to go. And then put your top hat back on. So there's nothing holding it in place. A little trick you can do for your top hat is to get you a little glob of grease and basically fill in that hole just like that. And just set it right into the grease. So what that's doing, what this little, like I call it the top hat, is actually your spring seat. The spring for your valve pin and valve seat, they're just sitting right there on it. It's just sitting right there. So once it's in the gun, you don't have to worry about it coming off at all, because it's always going to have spring tension against it. It's just while you're resealing, you have to make sure you don't lose it. Okay, last but not least is your regulator assembly. I do have a video going over a reseal of an amp regulator, but I'll go over it again in this video. So we're going to start with the simplest first. You got your regulator piston. This is a 4 by 1.5 MBR 70. It's really easy to change out. Get your square end. Stab the O-ring and fold it over. And once you have your new O-ring that's all lubed up, you just take it, start in the groove, roll it over. It's really soft O-ring typically, so it's really easy to get on. So that's done. Go to the next hardest, which is your housing. It's not very hard. It's just you have to understand that there's an O-ring inside here. I'm going to try to show that the best I can. It's inside, so you're going to take the square, stab into it, and pull towards the center. And then pull out eventually. Oh, almost got it. There you go. Just like that. You have to make sure not to scratch your sealing surfaces. This base is not a sealing surface. The sealing surface is the actual O-ring groove inside there. So you have to make sure you don't stab into the brass. Just lightly stab into the O-ring and start pulling it out. You can pull out and then twist the dental tool that you're using in order to get a better grab onto the O-ring, and then you can pull straight out, and the O-ring will come with it. Anyways, we're going to set that O-ring to the side now and get to the next one. This O-ring for the AMP or the amp regulator is a 7.5 by 2 MBR 70. It's kind of just like the valve housing. Stab into the O-ring, pull out, and then pull over the top. We got 2 O-rings here. They're lubed up. It's going to be pretty easy to reinstall. Well, relatively easy. The first one is you just get it started in the groove and roll it over the top, just like the valve housing one. This is where it gets a little tricky. You have to pinch the O-ring to get inside. Then you're going to use a tool of some sort. I recommend typically not using a sharp tool, using like an Allen key or something. But basically you got to get the O-ring started in the groove. So once you have it pinched in there, stick something through the middle of the O-ring to pull it into the groove, and then you're just going to press down with your finger for the rest of it. And then the last little piece will be sticking out in like a U shape right here. You just take whatever tool you're using and just gently press against it. And it'll pop itself into that hole. So there, the reg housing is now resealed. And for the last piece of the regulator, you've got the regulator screw. Now this is a pretty difficult one, to be honest, because it is working with such a small O-ring. It's a 2x1 MBR 90. And with that being 90, it's also very brittle O-ring. So with that being said, it's a little bit difficult to work with, but it is definitely possible. It's best to use if you have a vise, or another trick is to take your valve or your regulator housing and thread it in backwards. It's not cross-threading or anything, it's just threading it upside down. It's still the same thread. So now you have a little grip. Now as you can see, it bottoms out eventually. You can't really get to the last O-ring like this. It's very difficult. My best suggestion is use a pair of forceps to pinch the O-ring and just snap it off, since you're not going to be reusing that O-ring. Yeah, these are very small hemostats. Typically, I think they're called mosquito hemostats. In any case, they're very small ones. But I think it's the smallest type of hemostat you can get. It's best for this application. You have to take the corners of it and grab the O-ring as tight as you can and just pull. It'll snap the O-ring in the process, but it's better than scratching up your regulator screw. You scratch a regular screw, you'll have to replace it because it will no longer seal. But in that case, you've just broken an O-ring that you're replacing anyways. So set that to the side and do that with the other one. Use the corners of the jaw, grab really tight, and pull, and break that O-ring. If you have there's typically no real way to save the O-rings to remove them. And I wouldn't trust an O-ring once I've removed it to seal again anyways. So in any case, like I said, they're 2x1 MBR 90. There's two of them. So first we're going to slide it onto this first groove, and the second we'll go into the second groove. When working with these tiny O-rings, if you're going to order them, I would always recommend ordering more than just what you need, ordering more than two, because more than likely you'll break at least one or lose one while trying to install them. So to install, since they are so small, you need to use a lot of force to get them on. Also, since they're MBR 90, so it's easiest if you set it down. You're going to do it just like you did the valve housing and the regulator housing here. You're going to start in the groove and then roll it over. So it's hard to see, but you take your fingernails or you take your fingers, start in the groove, and then roll it over. That rolling over portion is typically where the O-ring will snap, because it's going over the edge right there and it's stretching to its fullest extent. You can do the same thing with the second one. There's no groove to start on, so you just hold it on the side, take it and gently roll it over, and it'll go down, and you'll notice the first groove it sets into, this is just a groove for the air to flow more easily into the regulator screw, so it's not where the O-ring goes. It goes to the next groove down. So it goes in that second groove right there. There's only supposed to be two O-rings on there, so that'll show you where it goes. So unthread it out of the housing, and there you go. There's your regulator screw. Now that we've covered all the parts that go into the gun, we've resealed all those. There's a couple more O-rings. The two O-rings for the gauges, and then an O-ring down in the regulator bore. I call it the regulator bore because it's the hole that's bored into the action for the regulator. There's an O-ring down there that seals on the outside of your regulator housing on this smooth, shiny section right here. It typically sits right above your regulator washers, and it seals the atmosphere hole for the side of the block here. So if you have a leak coming out the side of the block here at the atmosphere hole, it will either be one of your 4x1.5s, which there's one inside the housing, one on the bottom of your piston, or it is the 10x1.5 for the amp regulator that seals on the outside of this area that is inside your regulator bore. It's very tricky to get to. You will definitely need a angled pick just like this to get in there, because essentially the process is you have to take the pick, stab into the side of the O-ring, twist it out of a groove, push the O-ring down, and once it's there, you pull the pick out, get behind the O-ring, hook it, and then pull it out. The way to find the O-ring, I can't really show it on the film here because it's in a black O-ring inside of a very dark black hole, and can't really shine light down to show it properly because it is inset into a groove. You gently run your pick down the threads, and then you'll feel that stop, and you'll feel something soft and round. After that, it's smooth metal. So it's that soft and round that you're feeling with the pick. That's your O-ring. So you want to go into the middle of that, stab into it, twist your pick out. Well, let's see if I can get a better stab. I might need to try the other side. So run it down, stab into the O-ring. I'm going to show this whole process to show how tedious it is. It's not easy to get this O-ring out, and you have to be very careful not to scratch your action in the process. There you go. So I got it down. Now I can get my pick behind it, turn around, and pull it right on out. So there, I swear there was an O-ring in there, as you can tell. I just pulled it out. It's hard to get to. It's almost unbelievable that there is an O-ring in there sometimes because it's so hard to get out, so hard to see. But there's definitely an O-ring in there, and it's also diameter 90. Like I said, it's a 10 by 1.5 NBR 90. So it's a very difficult O-ring to get out. It fails very little. It's rare that this ever leaks. But if you're doing a full reseal in the action, it is best to go ahead and replace this. So before we install that, I'm just going to go ahead and pop out the 2 gauge shields real fast. They're really simple. They're sitting right there on top. Just like that. If they're O-rings or X-rings, they'll be simple like that. Sometimes there is Delrin, little Delrin discs that they have set in there, which it looks like these were left in. Sometimes they're also double stacked. You just want your square pick to get up underneath the Delrin, and you don't want to stab yourself. So after several attempts, as you can tell, there you go. Got the first Delrin out. And actually this person only had 1 Delrin down there, so sometimes there's 2. And these were loose in there. Another method is, if you don't want to use a pick, would be to take a flathead screwdriver. If they're up high enough, take a flathead screwdriver that fits in there. Heat up the tip of it so it's hot. Melt it into the Delrin. Then pull it out, once it cools off, you can go in there and screw the Delrin out as if it's a flathead screw. Sometimes when you do that, whenever you heat it up and cut a flathead into the Delrin, sometimes it'll just go ahead and snap the Delrin in half, which makes things really easy as well. Okay, so I've gotten both my Delrin out now. Set those to the side. And what I'm going to do first, since I'm not going to install the gauges yet, I'm going to install the gauges last. So I'm going to put the X-rings in last. Actually, you can go ahead and install the regulator next. So I've got this. I'm going to put a little extra lube on the outside. Just a very light layer. Around there so it slides nice and easy. I've got my regulator washers. Take that, slide my piston back in between them. So once I got the washers back onto my regulator piston here, I'm going to grab my pair of hemostats. I'm going to gently grab the top tip of the regulator piston. I'm going to set it down into the regulator bore. Make sure it goes all the way down. You'll hear it kind of snap into place, or else you might feel it. Now the trick I'm going to teach you today is, if you remember, I've not installed the 10 by 1.5 back down inside the regulator bore. That is because the O-ring groove for that 10 by 1.5 sits directly on top of those washers. So if you've installed your regulator piston and your washers in already, then you can just take that 10 by 1.5, set it in, and it'll set into place. As you see here, I already have my 10 by 1.5 all lubed up, the new one. And what you're going to do, just pinch it and get it in there. Just set it down in there. You can use your hemostats, you can use an Allen key, you can use whatever you want to. But basically, just by me setting it down there, one side of it has already set itself into the groove. So I just need to take the back side of that O-ring, press it down, and just keep pressing all the way around the O-ring. And until you can't see the O-ring anymore, once you can't see the O-ring anymore, then it's fully set in. And as you can see, I can still pull out the piston and the washers. It's officially in the O-ring groove. So now that that's in there, I can take my regular housing and thread that back in. It's going to take a 5mm. Once you get far enough for your fingers not be able to grab it, and you don't want to do it too tight. You can strip it out. You just want to make sure it's just hand tight, and it'll bomb itself out. And there'll be a slight rim on top of it to tell you that it's all the way down. So once your housing's in, the next thing is your regular screw. That just takes, you gotta jump past an O-ring groove real fast, and then it will be a 2.5. For reassembly, it's best to go ahead and tap it to the bottom and then pull it back up one turn. So you'll feel as you're turning, it'll start getting snug. You don't want to crank on it. You don't want to make it tight or anything. You just touch it to where it doesn't want to easily turn anymore, and turn it back out one full turn. So now I got my logo facing that way. So I'm going to do one full turn until it's facing that way again. That typically sets at about 50 bar. And once you have all the pressure on, then you can increase it from there to change it to the pressure that you want it to. After your regulator is installed, we're going to jump back here to your plenum plug. Go ahead and get that out of the way. We're just going to turn it in, and then we're going to use the regulator tool to put that in. When you're done, it'll come to a hard stop. You don't have to worry about cranking or anything like that. Once it's at a hard stop, you're good. Next thing we're going to do after your plenum plug is your power wheel. The first step will be to take your inner, and you've got your small notch there. That's corresponding to this screw right here. So you're going to take it, make sure it's at the bottom, just like so, and drop it straight in. Once you've confirmed you can't twist it back and forth because it's set on that screw, hold it in with your finger, flip the action over, take its little screw, the little countersunk, set in place, get your 2.5, and just thread it in. Just do finger tight for now, we'll crank it down later. So once that's in place, don't forget your ball bearing. Little ball bearing that sits right there. Then we're going to take the wheel. It doesn't matter what setting you put it at for now. You can turn it later. And take that, put it into place, wiggle it around a little bit, and then pop into place with your thumb. You'll feel it slide past the O-rings, and you can feel the click. Then you're going to take your screw, your center screw here, take that, and tighten it up. Then we're going to go on the back side here, make sure that one's very tight, and then you're good to go. You get your positive clicks there. Okay, great. So we got the power wheel in, we got the regulator, and we got your bottle adapter. The next stage will be to grab the new valve seat and the new valve pin, along with the valve housing, and to set that all in. Alright, so moving on, we've now got our valve assembly. So it'll be the valve housing, and then the new valve pin and new valve seat, along with the valve spring. That'll be going to right here, right above your bottle adapter and below your barrel. In order to insert your valve seat for the pre-Mark II, so the Crown Mark I and the Crown Mark I with the Picatinny, you'll be using this smaller valve seat. The Mark II has a larger valve seat that is very noticeable about which side to put it in or which direction. This one is a little bit difficult because it is tapered on each side. You can tell which way to put it in based off the O-ring groove. The O-ring will be the end that is thinner, or the closest to the O-ring is the side that goes in first. Now to seat this in there, it's hard to see down in there, but there is you'll see where the place is to actually set this in there. If you don't have a tool or anything, you can take your valve pin, or preferably your old valve pin, and use it to press it in there. It's pretty difficult, and that's why I said recommend the old valve pin, because you could possibly damage it. It's best to use, I have this valve seat tool. You just set it on there. It's made for all the different valve seats that FX has ever made, all the different sizes right there. So this one fits about the second or third level. Take that and just rest it in there, and then it'll pop into place. That pop into place lets you know that the O-ring is fully seated and the valve seat is now secure in there. After that, you would simply just take your valve pin, drop it in so that it goes into the valve seat. So I missed. There you go. Now it's in there. And you're going to probably want to take hemostats or your needle nose pliers. Set that on top just like that. And then as we're going in, as you see, I put the lube on here so the spring seat stays in place. You're going to do your best to line that up directly onto the valve pin. And there you go, it fell into place. And then you're just going to screw it on as much as you can by your fingers. Then you will grab your 4mm and finish it off. And it's just snug. You don't have to super crank it tight or anything like that. You just get to the bottom and that's it. You can tell if you installed it correctly based off viewing the tip of the valve pin right there. And also you'll be able to stick an Allen key in there, or anything that'll fit in there really, and you'll be able to push the valve pin back against the spring and it'll return back to where it was. Now that we have your valve assembly installed, now it's time to move on to the Foster fill connection. For the Foster connection, you have, or your fill connection, you've got your two parts here. You got your check valve and the quick connect. Basically just put the check valve in. You can do it sideways, upside down, however you would like. But at that point, you're just going to turn it in. Make sure the check valve stays straight. And turn it in, just like so. To finish tightening it, you will need a 14mm wrench. Or a socket. Just take it on there. And just get it tight. It's gonna bottom out, so it's only going to turn a certain way, so don't try to turn it any more than it actually is going to turn. So there you go. Now the Foster's installed. After we've installed your fill connection, now we can put in the gauge seals along with the gauges. So putting the gauge seals is literally just popping them into place. I'll wipe my hands off because I had a bunch of lube all over them. And you can use whatever you really want as long as it's not a sharp object. I would recommend something like a 4mm Allen. Just take them and press in the sides. So just a nice non-blunt sharp or non-sharp object to push those down. And the size of the X-ring that's recommended is 3.63 by 2.62 MBR70. And remember, that's an X-ring, not an O-ring. If you're not using that, then I would recommend the Delrin seals that can be provided off or from FX. And typically they're on the schematic. So now to install the gauges, it doesn't matter which order you go in. The tank pressure one goes up front, and the regulator pressure one goes in the back. For the crown, they're typically the same gauge. If you have an aftermarket gauge, then at that point, you may need to, like this person has had the regulator setting and their tank setting clearly marked. So you just need to make sure you put them back on the correct way. The final step of putting on your gauges is grabbing an 11mm wrench and making sure they're snug. And then once they're snug, you can feel them go against the seal. You'll want to zero them to whichever direction you want. You don't want to over tighten them, because if you over tighten them, it's going to smash onto the seal. It's going to block the gauge, and the gauge won't be reading pressure. You can easily remedy this by putting the bottle on, seeing that it's not reading pressure, and then turning it counterclockwise until it does read pressure. I would never turn it more than one full turn, just to make sure that you're not going to have a gauge pop off on you. So there you go. I feel contact of the seal. I'm just going to zero it. Just like so. So let's see. That one's straight. That one a little bit past straight. And that's also a great thing about the X-rings, is that they're a lot more forgiving than the Delrin. If you go too far in the Delrin and you try to loosen it back up, it's not going to seal anymore. Whereas an X-ring, it will refill the void. Okay, great. So we've got all of the O-ring required components on there. We did take off the trigger in order to access the Plenum Plug, so we're going to put that back on now. In order to reinstall the trigger, you have your trigger spring. You got your trigger sear right there, the back of the trigger sear. They're going to connect. And then remember, the pin's going to go through this hole right here, which lines up right here. So it's easiest if you set it down. You line up the spring onto the back of the sear. You press it down, and then you come from the side through the wheel, and there you go. Okay, so there's the reseal of the FX Crown. This is an FX Crown Mark 1, kind of like a Mark 1.5, because it does have the Picatinny rail, so it does have the newer power wheel on it. With that though, the Crown Mark II is going to have a different valve pin and valve seat installed inside, but it will be the same method of installation. There's not really much different to the Crown. The only thing that was different was the disassembly, reassembly of the power wheel. Like I said, this is more like the Mark II in that matter. Besides that, they're pretty much all the same across the model. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section below, or shoot me an email to info@910airguntuningandrepairsllc.com, or go check out the website www.910agtrllc.com. Alright, it's been great shooting this video, and as always, happy shooting.